The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse parking lot as Detective Riley Johnson walked toward her car. She had just finished giving testimony in a robbery case that had taken months to solve. The crisp October air felt good after sitting in the stuffy courtroom for 3 hours, answering questions from lawyers who seemed more interested in poking holes in her work than finding the truth. Riley pulled her phone from her jacket pocket and checked the time. It was barely 11 in the morning, but she already felt drained. Court days always did that to her. Something about the formal atmosphere and the pressure of getting every detail exactly right made her feel like she had run a marathon. She looked forward to getting back to the station and diving into her current case files. As she approached her black sedan, Riley noticed a few other cars scattered around the lot. A couple of lawyers were talking near the courthouse steps, their voices echoing off the concrete walls. The parking lot was mostly empty, which was normal for a weekday morning. Most people were either inside the courthouse or had already left after their hearings. Riley had parked in the back section of the lot away from the main entrance. She preferred the quieter spots where she could think clearly before and after court appearances. The space gave her a moment to mentally switch gears between her roles as a detective and as a witness. Today had been particularly challenging because the defense attorney had questioned every aspect of her investigation. She reached into her purse to find her car keys. Juggling her phone and a folder of case notes, the folder contained copies of all the documents she had referenced during her testimony, along with some notes for her next case. Riley always kept detailed records, a habit that had served her well during her 12 years on the force. Just as her fingers found the keys, she heard footsteps behind her. Heavy, quick footsteps that seemed to be coming her way. Riley glanced over her shoulder and saw a police officer walking toward her with purpose. She didn't recognize him, which wasn't unusual since the courthouse was used by officers from several different departments in the county. The officer was tall and stocky, with short brown hair and a stern expression. His uniform looked crisp and new, suggesting he might be relatively new to the force. Riley turned slightly to acknowledge him with a polite nod, assuming he was probably heading to his own car somewhere nearby. But instead of walking past her, the officer stopped about 10 feet away and called out in a sharp voice, "Hey, you need to step away from that vehicle right now." Riley looked around, confused. There was no one else in the immediate area, so he had to be talking to her. She turned to face him fully, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "Excuse me?" The officer took a few steps closer, his hand resting on his belt near his radio. His face was set in hard lines, and his eyes held an intensity that made Riley immediately alert. "I said step away from the car. Keep your hands where I can see them." Riley felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Something was very wrong here. She looked down at her professional outfit, a navy blue pantsuit and white blouse that she wore for court appearances. Her badge was clipped to her belt, partially hidden by her jacket but still visible. Her service weapon was holstered on her right hip, also partially concealed by her blazer. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Riley said, keeping her voice calm and steady. She had been in enough tense situations to know that escalating emotions only made things worse. "I'm Detective Johnson with the Metro Police Department. This is my vehicle." The officer's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked more suspicious. "Sure it is. I suppose you just happened to have keys to this expensive car, right? Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle." Riley couldn't believe what she was hearing. She glanced around the parking lot again, hoping to see someone else who might help clarify the situation, but they were alone in this section of the lot. The lawyers she had seen earlier were too far away to hear what was happening. "Look, I can show you my badge and identification," Riley said, slowly reaching toward her belt where her credentials were attached. "I just finished testifying in courtroom 3 about the Henderson robbery case." "Don't reach for anything," the officer shouted, his voice echoing off the surrounding cars. "I told you to put your hands on the car." "Do it now!" Riley's training kicked in. When dealing with an agitated officer, the safest approach was to comply with basic commands while trying to de-escalate the situation. She raised her hands slightly to show they were empty and took a small step toward her car. "My name is Detective Riley Johnson, badge number 4471, she said clearly. "You can verify that with dispatch. I've been with the department for 12 years and I'm currently assigned to the robbery division." But the officer wasn't listening. His face had grown red with anger, and his breathing was becoming more rapid. I'm tired of people like you thinking you can just take whatever you want. You think because you're dressed nice you can fool everybody? The words hit Riley like a physical blow. People like you. The meaning was crystal clear and it made her stomach turn. She had faced prejudice before in her career, but never from a fellow officer. Never this directly, never this aggressively. "Officer, please," Riley said, her voice still steady despite the anger building inside her. "Check my credentials, call it in. This is all a misunderstanding that can be cleared up in 30 seconds. Instead of reaching for his radio, the officer stepped closer. His face was now twisted with rage, and Riley could see the veins standing out on his neck. "The only misunderstanding here is you thinking you can play games with me. Turn around right now or I'll turn you around myself." Riley's mind raced through her options. She could try to show her badge again, but he had already told her not to reach for anything. She could attempt to call out to the lawyers near the courthouse, but they were too far away and probably wouldn't hear her. She could try to de-escalate further, but the officer seemed beyond reason. "I'm complying with your request," Riley said, turning slowly toward her car. "But I want you to know that you're making a serious mistake here." As she placed her hands on the roof of her car, Riley felt a mixture of anger and disbelief wash over her. In all her years as a police officer, she had never imagined she would be on this side of such an encounter. She had seen other officers act inappropriately, had even reported some of them, but experiencing it herself was something entirely different. Behind her, she could hear the officer breathing heavily. She could sense his continued agitation, and it made her nervous. Officers who let their emotions control them were dangerous to everyone around them, including themselves. Riley had seen enough situations go wrong to know that this could escalate quickly if she wasn't careful. "What's your name, officer?" Riley asked, keeping her voice calm. "I'd like to know who I'm dealing with here." "You don't need to know my name," came the sharp reply. "All you need to know is that you picked the wrong day to mess with the wrong cop." Riley closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Whatever happened next, she needed to stay professional. She needed to remember that she was representing not just herself, but every other officer who might find themselves in a similar situation. The way she handled this moment would matter, not just for her, but for the bigger picture of police accountability and justice. She had no idea that in the next few minutes, everything would change. Not just for her, but for the angry officer behind her, and for everyone who would eventually hear this story. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tense air like a knife. Riley kept her hands pressed against the roof of her car, feeling the cool metal against her palms while her heart hammered in her chest. The officer behind her was still breathing heavily, and she could sense his growing agitation with each passing second. "Great. Now you've got backup coming," the officer muttered behind her. Should have just cooperated from the beginning instead of making this complicated. Riley almost laughed at the irony, but she bit her tongue. She had been cooperating. She had been trying to show him her credentials. She had been telling the truth from the very first moment, but none of that seemed to matter to the man who had already made up his mind about who she was and what she was doing. 2 patrol cars pulled into the parking lot, their lights flashing, but sirens now silent. Riley could hear car doors slamming and footsteps approaching quickly across the asphalt. She felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, someone else would be here to sort out this mess. "What's the situation here, Rodriguez?" called out a familiar voice. Riley's heart jumped. She recognized that voice immediately. It was Officer Patricia Wells, someone she had worked with on several cases over the years. Patricia was a solid cop with a good reputation and a level head. If anyone could help clear up this misunderstanding, it would be her. "Got a possible car thief here," Rodriguez replied, his voice still tight with anger. "Found her messing around with this vehicle, and she's been giving me attitude ever since." Riley heard Patricia's footsteps getting closer. "Did you run her ID?" "Check for ownership papers. She claims to be a cop," Rodriguez said with a snort. "Detective Johnson or something. Like I'm supposed to believe that." The footsteps stopped abruptly. Riley could practically feel the change in atmosphere. Like the air itself had suddenly gotten thicker. There was a long moment of complete silence, broken only by the sound of radio chatter from the patrol cars. "Did you just say Detective Johnson?" Patricia's voice had changed completely. Gone was the casual professional tone. Now she sounded shocked, almost panicked. "Yeah, that's what she claims," Rodriguez replied. but Riley could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time. "Rodriguez, step back right now," Patricia ordered, her voice sharp with authority. "Step back from her immediately." Riley heard shuffling footsteps as Rodriguez moved away from her. She could sense confusion and growing alarm in his movements, but she didn't dare turn around yet. She had been in enough volatile situations to know that sudden movements could still make things worse. "Ma'am, you can turn around now," Patricia said gently. Slowly. Riley turned to face the group of officers, her hands still slightly raised to show they were empty. Patricia's face was pale with shock, and behind her stood two other officers Riley recognized from the station. One of them, Officer Kevin Chen, was staring at Rodriguez with a mixture of disbelief and horror. "Detective Johnson," Patricia said, her voice filled with dismay. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" Rodriguez looked like he had been struck by lightning. His face had gone from red with anger to completely white. His mouth hung open as he stared at Riley, and she could see the exact moment when the full weight of what he had done hit him. "I'm okay," Riley said quietly, though her shoulder was still sore from where Rodriguez had grabbed her earlier. "Just a little shaken up." Kevin stepped forward, his expression grave. "Rodriguez, do you have any idea who you just detained?" Rodriguez seemed unable to speak. He kept looking between Riley and the other officers as if hoping someone would tell him this was all some kind of joke. But the serious expressions on everyone's faces made it clear that this was very real and very serious. "Detective Johnson has been with the department for 12 years, Patricia explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. "She's one of our most experienced robbery investigators. She was probably here testifying in court this morning." "The Henderson case," Riley confirmed, her voice steady despite everything that had happened. "I just finished giving testimony about an hour ago." Rodriguez finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. You thought what?" Kevin demanded, stepping closer to Rodriguez. "You thought you could just grab someone without checking their credentials? Without asking any questions? Without following any kind of proper procedure?" Riley watched Rodriguez's face as the reality of the situation continued to sink in. She could see fear replacing the anger that had been there before, fear about what this would mean for his career, his reputation, his future. Part of her felt sorry for him despite everything he had put her through. "Detective," Patricia said, turning back to Riley. "Do you need medical attention? Should we call paramedics?" Riley shook her head. "No, I'm fine. Just bruised." But even as she said it, she could feel the soreness in her shoulder where Rodriguez had grabbed her. Her head was still a little tender from where it had hit the wall of the building when he pushed her. The physical pain was manageable, but the emotional impact was something else entirely. "What were you thinking, Rodriguez?" Patricia continued, her voice rising slightly. "Even if she wasn't a detective, even if she was just a regular citizen, you can't just physically restrain someone without cause. Where's your training? Where's your common sense?" Rodriguez looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. "I saw her by the car and I just assumed. Look at this neighborhood. Look at that car." "It didn't seem what?" Kevin interrupted sharply. "Didn't seem like she belonged here? Didn't seem like she could afford a nice car? What exactly are you trying to say?" The uncomfortable silence that followed spoke volumes. Riley had heard enough coded language in her career to know exactly what Rodriguez was trying not to say. The assumption he had made about her had nothing to do with her behavior and everything to do with the color of her skin. "This is a nightmare," Patricia muttered, running her hand through her hair. "Rodriguez, you realize this is going to have to be reported, right? There's going to be an investigation. Internal Affairs is going to want to talk to everyone involved." Rodriguez nodded miserably. "I know, I messed up. I messed up bad." Riley watched the exchange with mixed feelings. On one hand, she was glad that her fellow officers were taking this seriously. It would have been easy for them to try to sweep it under the rug or minimize what had happened. But their shock and dismay were genuine, and that gave her some hope. On the other hand, the fact that this had happened at all was deeply troubling. Rodriguez was a police officer. He was supposed to be trained to handle situations like this professionally. He was supposed to know better than to make assumptions about people based on their appearance. "Detective Johnson," Patricia said, turning back to her, "I want you to know that this isn't representative of how we do things. This isn't who we are as a department, Riley nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed that. If Rodriguez felt comfortable acting this way, if he felt confident enough in his assumptions to physically detain someone without any evidence of wrongdoing, then there might be bigger problems in the department than anyone wanted to admit. What happens now? Riley asked. Now we follow procedure, Kevin said firmly. We document everything that happened here. We make sure there's a proper investigation, and we make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Riley looked around at the group of officers, then back at Rodriguez, who was still standing there looking shell-shocked. She thought about all the times she had heard stories like this from other people, stories she had sometimes doubted or minimized. Now she was living one of those stories herself. Actually, Riley said slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. I think I have a different idea about what should happen next. The other officers looked at her with surprise. Rodriguez looked up for the first time since learning who she really was, fear and confusion clear in his eyes. Riley took a deep breath. What she was about to propose would surprise everyone, including herself. But sometimes the most unexpected response was the one that could create the most meaningful change. The silence in the parking lot was deafening as all eyes turned to Riley. Rodriguez stood frozen, probably expecting her to demand his badge and gun right there on the spot. Patricia and Kevin exchanged glances, clearly wondering what their colleague was thinking. The morning sun seemed brighter now, casting sharp shadows that made the whole scene feel surreal. Riley took a deep breath and looked directly at Rodriguez. The fear in his eyes was obvious, but underneath it she could see something else. Shame. Real, genuine shame. Not just because he had been caught making a mistake, but because he was beginning to understand the weight of what he had done. Officer Rodriguez, Riley said, her voice calm but firm. I'm not going to file charges against you today. The collective gasp from the other officers was audible. Rodriguez's eyes widened in disbelief. Patricia stepped forward, her expression concerned. Detective, you don't have to make that decision right now, Patricia said quickly. You've been through a traumatic experience. Maybe you should take some time to think about it. Riley shook her head. I've already thought about it. But I'm not doing this out of kindness, and I'm not doing it to protect him. She gestured toward Rodriguez. I'm doing it because I think there's a bigger problem here that needs to be addressed. Kevin frowned. What do you mean? Riley pulled out her phone and scrolled through her photo gallery until she found what she was looking for. 3 weeks ago, I was having lunch at the diner on 5th Street when I witnessed an officer from our department stop a black teenager for suspicious behavior. The kid was walking home from school with his backpack. The officer searched him, found nothing, and let him go. But not before humiliating him in front of a dozen witnesses. She showed them a photo she had discreetly taken from inside the diner. 2 weeks ago, I saw an officer pull over a Latina woman for supposedly speeding. I was behind them in traffic. She wasn't speeding, but she got a ticket anyway. Patricia's expression was growing more troubled by the minute. Riley, are you saying... I'm saying that what happened to me today wasn't an isolated incident, Riley continued. I'm saying that Officer Rodriguez felt comfortable, enough to physically detain someone, based purely on assumptions because he's probably seen other officers do similar things without consequences. Rodriguez finally found his voice. Detective, I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything yet, Riley replied. Just listen. She put her phone away and looked around at the group. Here's what I propose. Instead of filing charges and letting Rodriguez become a scapegoat while the real problems continue, I want to use this incident as a starting point for something bigger. Like what? Kevin asked, though he sounded skeptical. Riley had been thinking about this for months, ever since she had started noticing the patterns of behavior that troubled her. She had kept detailed notes, taken photos when possible, and collected information about complaints that had been filed and then quietly dismissed. Today's incident had just confirmed what she already suspected. I want to request a meeting with Chief Martinez, Internal Affairs, and the Community Relations Board, Riley said. I want to present a comprehensive proposal for bias training, accountability measures, and community oversight that addresses the root causes of incidents like this. Rodriguez looked confused. But what about me? What about what I did to you? Riley turned to him, and for the first time since the incident began, her expression softened slightly. What you did to me was wrong. It was unprofessional, It was based on prejudice, and it could have escalated into something much worse. But destroying your career isn't going to fix the system that made you think this behavior was acceptable. So you're just going to let him off the hook? Patricia asked, her voice tight with frustration. No, Riley said firmly. I'm going to hold him accountable in a way that actually creates change instead of just punishment. She looked back at Rodriguez. Here's the deal. You're going to be part of the solution. You're going to work with me on developing and implementing this new training program. You're going to visit community groups and listen to their concerns. You're going to help other officers understand how their unconscious biases affect their decisions. Rodriguez stared at her in amazement. You want me to help you? I want you to do the work to become a better officer, Riley corrected. And I want you to help make sure that what happened today never happens to anyone else. Kevin was shaking his head. Riley, I understand what you're trying to do, but this is a huge risk. What if Rodriguez doesn't follow through? What if he goes back to his old ways? Riley had thought about that too. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But I think people are capable of change when they're given the opportunity and the motivation to do better. She pulled a small notebook from her jacket pocket and flipped through several pages covered with her neat handwriting. I've been documenting incidents like this for months. I have dates, times, locations, and witness statements. I have photos and video when I could get them. I have copies of complaints that were filed and then buried. Patricia's eyes widened. How many incidents are we talking about? 47 documented cases in the past 6 months, Riley said quietly. And those are just the ones I personally witnessed or heard about. I'm sure there are many more. The number hung in the air like a heavy weight. Rodriguez looked sick. Even Kevin, who had seemed skeptical of Riley's approach, now looked troubled. Rodriguez, Riley said, turning back to him, I want you to understand something. You're not the worst officer in this department. You're probably not even close. But you made a choice today that could have ruined both of our lives. The question now is whether you're going to make better choices going forward. Rodriguez nodded slowly. I want to try. I want to do better. Good, Riley said. Because this isn't going to be easy. Real change never is. She closed her notebook and looked around at the group again. Here's what's going to happen next. Rodriguez and I are going to the station together. We're going to file a report about what happened here, and we're going to include it as part of a larger proposal for departmental reform. What kind of reform? Patricia asked. Riley had been thinking about this for a long time, and she had specific ideas about what needed to change. Mandatory bias training for all officers, not just the one-day workshop we do now. Regular community meetings where citizens can voice concerns without fear of retaliation. Body camera requirements for all interactions with civilians. And most importantly, a peer intervention program where officers are trained and required to step in when they see their colleagues acting inappropriately. That's ambitious, Kevin said. It needs to be ambitious, Riley replied. Half measures and Band-Aid solutions aren't going to fix this problem. Rodriguez spoke up again, his voice shaky but determined. What do you need me to do? Riley looked at him carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. First, you need to admit to yourself and others that what you did today was wrong. Not just a mistake, but wrong, based on prejudice and assumptions that have no place in police work. Rodriguez swallowed hard. It was wrong. It was completely wrong. Second, you need to understand that this is going to be uncomfortable. You're going to hear things about police behavior that will make you angry and defensive. You're going to have to confront your own biases and the biases of your fellow officers. You're going to have to change the way you think about your job and your community. I understand, Rodriguez said. And third, Riley continued, you need to commit to seeing this through. This isn't a quick fix or a public relations gesture. This is about fundamentally changing how we do police work in this city. Riley looked around at all the officers present. Actually, that goes for all of us. We can't just put this on Rodriguez and call it solved. We all have to be part of the solution. Patricia nodded slowly. You're right. We all need to do better. So what's the first step? Kevin asked. Riley smiled for the first time since the incident began. The first step is walking into Chief Martinez's office and telling him that we need to have a very serious conversation about the future of this department. As they began walking toward their cars to head back to the station, Riley felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. She knew that what she was proposing wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance from some officers, skepticism from the community, and bureaucratic obstacles at every turn. But she also knew that doing nothing wasn't an option. Today had shown her that the problems she had been documenting weren't going away on their own. It was time to take action, even if that action looked different from what everyone expected. Chief Martinez's office felt smaller than usual with 6 people crowded around his desk. Riley sat across from the chief, her detailed notebook open in front of her. Rodriguez sat to her left, looking like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Captain Torres from Internal Affairs was taking notes on a legal pad, while Patricia and Kevin flanked the room near the windows. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Chief Martinez said, leaning back in his leather chair. His weathered face showed a mixture of concern and disbelief. "You're telling me that instead of filing charges against Officer Rodriguez, you want to use this incident to overhaul our entire training and oversight system?" Riley nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying, Chief. Punishing Rodriguez might make everyone feel better in the short term, but it won't solve the underlying problems that led to this situation." Captain Torres looked up from his notes. "Detective Johnson, I appreciate your perspective, but we have protocols for handling situations like this. Officer Rodriguez violated several department policies, not to mention your civil rights. There have to be consequences." "There will be consequences," Riley said firmly. "Just not the kind everyone expects." She opened her notebook and pulled out a thick folder she had prepared over the weekend. "Chief, I've documented 47 incidents of problematic police behavior in the past 6 months. Traffic stops without probable cause, excessive force during routine arrests, harassment of community members who were doing nothing wrong. And those are just the ones I personally witnessed or had reported to me." Chief Martinez took the folder and began flipping through it, his expression growing more troubled with each page. "Why didn't you bring this to my attention sooner?" "Because I wanted to make sure I had enough evidence to show this was a pattern, not just a few bad apples," Riley replied. "And because I wanted to have a solution ready, not just a list of problems." Rodriguez spoke up for the first time since they had entered the office. "Chief, I know what I did was wrong. Detective Johnson has every right to file charges against me, but if she thinks there's a way to turn this into something positive, something that could help other officers avoid making the same mistakes I made, then I want to be part of that." Captain Torres frowned. "Rodriguez, you realize that cooperation doesn't erase what happened in that parking lot?" "I'm not trying to erase it," Rodriguez said, his voice steady despite the obvious nervousness. "I'm trying to learn from it, and I'm trying to make sure it never happens again." Riley appreciated Rodriguez's response, but she could tell that both the chief and Captain Torres were still skeptical about her approach. She needed to give them something concrete, something they could understand in practical terms. "Here's what I'm proposing," Riley said, pulling out a detailed outline she had worked on all weekend. "A 6-month pilot program that addresses training, accountability, and community relations simultaneously." Chief Martinez set down the folder of incident reports and picked up Riley's proposal. "Walk me through this." "First, mandatory bias training for every officer in the department. Not a one-day seminar, but an ongoing program that includes role-playing, case studies, and regular assessment. Officers who don't successfully complete the training don't go back on patrol." "That's going to be expensive," Captain Torres pointed out. "It's going to be a lot less expensive than the lawsuits we'll face if we don't address these issues," Riley countered. "And it's definitely less expensive than losing community trust completely." Chief Martinez nodded slowly. "What else?" "Second, a peer intervention program. Officers will be trained to recognize when their colleagues are acting inappropriately and required to step in. No more looking the other way when someone crosses the line." Patricia spoke up from her position near the window. "That's going to be controversial. Officers don't like the idea of policing each other." "Then they shouldn't be police officers," Riley said bluntly. "If we can't hold ourselves accountable, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Detective Johnson is right. If another officer had been there today, if they had seen what I was doing and stopped me, none of this would have happened." Chief Martinez was reading through Riley's proposal more carefully now. "This community oversight board you're suggesting, how would that work?" "Monthly meetings where community members can voice concerns and provide feedback on police interactions. Not just complaints, but positive feedback too. And most importantly, real response to those concerns. When someone brings up a legitimate issue, we address it publicly and transparently." Captain Torres shook his head. That sounds like a recipe for constant criticism and second-guessing. Maybe, Riley admitted, but it's also a recipe for improvement, and it's definitely better than the alternative, which is continuing to operate in a bubble while community trust erodes completely. Chief Martinez closed the proposal and looked around the room. This is ambitious, Detective Johnson. Maybe too ambitious. Change this significant usually takes years, not months. Chief, with respect, we don't have years, Riley said. We have a community that's losing faith in us, officers who are making decisions based on prejudice rather than training, and a department that's developing a reputation for the wrong reasons. She gestured toward Rodriguez. What happened to me could happen to any citizen in this city. The only difference is that I had a badge to eventually prove who I was. What about the people who don't have badges? What about the teenagers walking home from school, or the parents going to work, or the families just trying to live their lives? The room fell silent as everyone considered her words. Riley could see that her arguments were having an impact, but she also knew that institutional change was never easy. There would be resistance from officers who felt their authority was being questioned, from budget officials who worried about costs, and from politicians who preferred to avoid controversial topics. What role would Rodriguez play in all this? Chief Martinez asked. Riley looked at Rodriguez, who straightened up in his chair. He would be our case study. He would participate in every aspect of the new training program. And he would share his experience with other officers. He would visit community groups and listen to their concerns. And he would help us understand how an otherwise decent officer could make such a serious error in judgment. You really think I'm a decent officer? Rodriguez asked, surprise evident in his voice. Riley considered the question carefully. I think you're an officer who made a terrible mistake, based on unconscious bias and poor training. I think you reacted emotionally instead of professionally, but I also think you're genuinely sorry and willing to do the work to change. That makes you better than a lot of officers who would just deny responsibility and blame everyone else. Captain Torres was still taking notes, but Riley could tell he was becoming more interested in the proposal. What about oversight? How do we make sure this program actually works? Regular assessments, community feedback, and data tracking, Riley replied. We measure things like complaint rates, use of force incidents, community satisfaction surveys, and officer retention. If the numbers don't improve, we adjust the program. If they do improve, we expand it. Chief Martinez stood up and walked to the window looking out at the city beyond. Detective Johnson, I have to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Are you doing this because you really think it will work? Or because you're trying to avoid the negative publicity that would come from filing charges? Riley had expected this question, and she was ready for it. Chief, if I cared about avoiding publicity, I would have handled this quietly from the beginning. I could have accepted Rodriguez's apology and moved on. But that wouldn't have solved anything. She stood up as well, facing the chief directly. I'm doing this because I believe police work can be better than what we saw in that parking lot today. I'm doing this because I think our community deserves officers who are trained to see people as individuals, not stereotypes. And I'm doing this because I think Rodriguez and officers like him can change if we give them the tools and motivation to do so. Chief Martinez turned back to face the room. This is going to require approval from the city council. It's going to require budget allocations. It's going to require buy-in from the entire department. I know, Riley said, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it happen. Including working closely with the officer who assaulted you? Captain Torres asked. Riley looked at Rodriguez, who was watching her with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Especially that. If Rodriguez and I can work together to create positive change after what happened between us, it sends a powerful message about the possibility of reconciliation and growth. Chief Martinez was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing all the factors involved. Finally, he sat back down and picked up Riley's proposal again. All right, Detective Johnson, you've got my attention. Let's talk about how we make this work. For the first time since entering the chief's office, Riley allowed herself to smile. She knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult process, but it was a start. And sometimes, getting started was the hardest part of creating meaningful change. 6 months later, Riley stood at the podium in the community center, looking out at a room filled with police officers, community leaders, and residents from across the city. The transformation that had taken place seemed almost impossible to believe, even for someone who had lived through every step of it. The evening had started with testimonials from community members who had participated in the new oversight program. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman from the Riverside neighborhood, had spoken about how different her interactions with police had become since the reforms were implemented. "Before I was afraid to call for help," she had said. "Now the officers know my name. They know my concerns. They treat me like a person, not a problem." Rodriguez sat in the front row, wearing his dress uniform but looking completely different from the angry, prejudiced officer Riley had encountered in that courthouse parking lot. The past 6 months had changed him in ways that went far beyond his professional behavior. He had lost weight, started reading books about social justice and community policing, and begun volunteering at a local youth center in his free time. "Ladies and gentlemen," Riley said, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. 6 months ago, this department faced a choice. We could continue operating the way we always had, hoping that problems would solve themselves, or we could admit that we needed to change and commit to doing the hard work that real change requires. The audience was quiet and attentive. Riley could see Mayor Williams in the third row, taking notes on everything being said. Next to him sat Chief Martinez, who had become one of the strongest advocates for the reform program after initially expressing skepticism. "Change is never easy," Riley continued. "It requires us to look honestly at our failures and shortcomings. It requires us to admit when we've been wrong, and it requires us to stay committed even when the work gets difficult." She paused and looked directly at Rodriguez. 6 months ago, Officer Rodriguez made a serious mistake that could have destroyed both of our careers and deepened the divide between police and community. Instead, we chose to use that moment as a catalyst for transformation. Rodriguez stood up when Riley gestured toward him. His nervousness was obvious, but so was his determination to see this through. "I want to thank Detective Johnson for giving me a chance to be part of the solution, instead of just part of the problem," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. The crowd remained silent, listening intently as Rodriguez continued. "What I did in that parking lot was wrong. It was based on prejudice, fear, and assumptions that had no place in police work. But Detective Johnson showed me that acknowledging my mistakes was just the first step toward becoming a better officer and a better person." Riley felt a surge of pride as she watched Rodriguez speak. The transformation in his attitude and approach had been remarkable, but it hadn't been easy. There had been moments of frustration, setbacks, and difficult conversations, but he had stuck with the program even when it challenged everything he thought he knew about police work. Captain Torres, now the director of the new Training and Community Relations Division, stood up to present the 6-month assessment report. The numbers he shared were impressive. Complaints against officers were down 40%, community satisfaction surveys showed significant improvement, and officer retention rates had actually increased despite the more rigorous training requirements. "But the most important change isn't captured in these statistics," Captain Torres said. "It's the change in culture. Officers are talking to each other differently. They're interacting with the community differently, and they're holding themselves and their colleagues to higher standards." Riley thought about all the changes she had witnessed over the past 6 months. The monthly community meetings had become genuine forums for dialogue, rather than just complaint sessions. Officers were participating in neighborhood events and building relationships with residents. And perhaps most importantly, the peer intervention program was working. Officers were stepping in when they saw problematic behavior, and they were doing it with support from department leadership. The success hadn't been universal. A few officers had left the department rather than participate in the new training programs. Some community members remained skeptical about whether the changes would last, and there were still incidents that required investigation and response. But the overall trajectory was clearly positive. "I want to share a story that illustrates how much things have changed," Riley said, returning to the microphone. "Last week, Officer Rodriguez responded to a call about a suspicious person in the Millbrook neighborhood. When he arrived, he found a young black man sitting in a car outside an apartment complex. The room grew very quiet. Everyone understood the significance of this scenario, given what had happened 6 months earlier. The old Officer Rodriguez might have immediately approached with suspicion and assumptions," Riley continued. "But the new Officer Rodriguez did something different. He introduced himself politely, asked if everything was okay, and listened to the man's explanation that he was waiting for his girlfriend to come downstairs. Rodriguez nodded, remembering the incident clearly. I thanked him for his time, gave him my card, and told him to call if he ever needed anything. It was a normal, respectful interaction between a police officer and a citizen. The young man later called the station to compliment Officer Rodriguez on his professionalism. Riley added, "That's the kind of police work we should be doing every day." The applause that followed was genuine and sustained. Riley could see tears in the eyes of some community members who had shared their own negative experiences with police during the early stages of the reform process. Mayor Williams stood up to address the crowd. "This program has exceeded everyone's expectations," he said. "We're already getting calls from other cities asking how they can implement similar reforms. Detective Johnson and Officer Rodriguez have shown us that even the most difficult situations can become opportunities for positive change." After the formal presentations ended, Riley found herself surrounded by people wanting to know more about the program. A group of officers from a neighboring city were particularly interested in the peer intervention training. Several community activists wanted to discuss how the oversight board could be improved even further. But the conversation that meant the most to Riley came from an unexpected source. A teenage boy approached her near the refreshment table, his mother close behind him. "Detective Johnson," the boy said, "I just wanted to thank you for what you've done. My mom and I used to be scared every time we saw a police car. But last month, when our car broke down on Highway 6, the officer who stopped to help us was really nice. He called a tow truck for us and waited until it arrived to make sure we were safe." Riley smiled and shook the boy's hand. "That's how it should always be. You should never have to be afraid of the people whose job it is to protect you." As the evening wound down, Riley and Rodriguez found themselves alone in the community center parking lot. It was almost exactly the same time of day as their first encounter, and the parallel wasn't lost on either of them. "Detective," Rodriguez said, "I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. Thank you for seeing something in me that I didn't see in myself. Thank you for believing that I could change." Riley looked at him thoughtfully. "You know what the most important thing is about all this?" "What's that?" "It's not that you changed. It's that you chose to change. Nobody could force you to examine your biases or challenge your assumptions. You had to decide to do that work yourself." Rodriguez nodded. "It wasn't easy. There were times when I wanted to quit, when I thought it would be easier to just find another job. But you didn't quit," Riley pointed out. "And now you're helping other officers make the same journey." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on how much had changed since that tense confrontation 6 months earlier. The parking lot looked the same, but everything else was completely different. "What's next?" Rodriguez asked. Riley smiled. "Next, we keep doing the work. We keep listening to the community. We keep training officers. We keep holding ourselves accountable. And we keep proving that police departments can change when they're willing to do what's necessary." As they walked to their cars, Riley felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The road ahead would still have challenges, and there would always be more work to do. But they had proven that even the most entrenched problems could be addressed when people were willing to choose transformation over punishment, growth over defensiveness, and hope over cynicism. The story that had begun with anger and prejudice had become a story about the power of second chances, the importance of accountability, and the possibility of creating positive change even in the most unlikely circumstances. And perhaps most importantly, it had become a model that other communities could follow in their own efforts to build trust between police and the people they serve.